There we go. Um, if you recall from last week, John Shutt, and again, the handouts you have will help us here, but this is, again, a lot less filled in to hopefully focus our attention a bit more. Showed us the short video clip of the from the Bible Project and on 1 Samuel particularly, but of course the books are meant to be taken together, 1 and 2 Samuel. So the outline is concerned with three main characters. I'll add a fourth to that, and their kind of their trajectories or their rise and fall. The prophet Samuel, of course, is the focus in 1 Samuel 1:7, followed by the rise and fall of Saul in 1 Samuel 8 through 31, followed by the rise and fall of David that takes us through 2 Samuel 20, which we'll address this morning, and there's a bit of overlap, obviously. And then the 2 Samuel concludes with a kind of an encapsulating last four chapters that look back on the previous 51 or whatever. So the delineation between 1 and 2 Samuel happens at the end of this overlapping period between Saul and David. Indeed, we could see both books chronicling the overlapping arcs of blessing and judgment of four main characters. I don't know if you're going to be able to tell which of these lines I drew, but we have Eli coming in, obviously at the start of before the start of 1 Samuel, and then of course we have Samuel himself, and so we've got it's very crude, but a bit of overlap just to see how the main characters are chronologically related to one another, and how their rise of blessing and ascension then falls into sin and degradation. So we see the downfall of Eli at the outset of 1 Samuel, and this is mostly due to the sins of his sons, which is a theme, juxtaposed against the rise of Samuel. And later in 1 Samuel, we read of the lessening of Samuel himself, mostly again due to the sins of his son, juxtaposed against the blessing and rise of Saul. Next, we see God's condemnation of Saul, mostly due to his own malevolent behavior and ultimate death, juxtaposed against David's growing fame and favor with God and the Israelites at the end of 1 Samuel and the start of 2 Samuel. Lastly, we observe God blessing David as he takes his rightful place as king and unites Israel, only to be followed by his slide that we all know of into sin and judgment. We won't go into detail about 2 Samuel verse by verse this morning. We don't have time for it. We're going to hit on the main flashpoints of David's life and not dwell too much on the main flashpoints that you will obviously be familiar with. Instead, we're going to look at a brief outline, chapter by chapter. We're going to talk about the unorthodox conclusion to 2 Samuel and Samuel as a set of books. And then we're going to drill down in the middle of all that into chapter 7 and look at God's dynastic and messianic promise to David. And I also won't spend a lot of time or much time at all talking about authorship, dating, locations, etc., because John covered a good chunk of that last week. But all I'll say for context is that as I already mentioned, these two books were designed to be taken as one. Not designed to be; they were one book. And they were unified up until about the 15th century A.D., when the Hebrew Old Testament was translated into Greek, and they added vowels, and that got too lengthy, so they broke it up. In fact, 1st and 2nd Kings joined 1st and 2nd Samuel in the new Greek arrangement at that time, with 1st and 2nd Samuel being called 1st and 2nd Reigns, maybe you've heard that, and 1st and 2nd Kings being called 3rd and 4th Reigns. This makes sense since these accounts were meant to be taken together. 1st and 2nd Samuel covers the loose affiliation of the tribes in the period of the nascent unified kingship. Eventually they consolidate in that period of Israel's history. After Israel's period of blessing at the outset of its monarchy, 1st and 2nd Kings catalogs the progressive slide into corruption, defeat, and ultimately exile. So let's take a look at a high-level overview and some highlights of 2 Samuel. And when we arrive at chapter 1, verse 1, we have two important pieces of information in mind that John talked about last week. First is 1 Samuel 8, records the demand of the Hebrews for a king, just like the surrounding nations had. We've been through that. Though the request is foolish, God grants it. And thus we have the ascension of Saul, God's anointed king, to the throne, followed by his wicked behavior and eventual death. Just like many other works of antiquity and some books of the Old Testament, 1 Samuel ends with its main character's grisly demise. So in setting out in 2 Samuel, the events of 1 Samuel 30 have already happened, but David is not aware of that, right? He has just returned from battling the Amalekites, and an Amalekite arrives in David's camp, a young man. He arrives at his camp in Ziklag and recounts his part in Saul and Saul's son Jonathan's deaths. So he relays that he was the one that put at least Saul to the sword, or finished him off, so to speak. David and his men mourn, and he puts the Amalekite to death for his part in it. Though the young man appears to be trying to win David's favor here, David takes him at his words and assigns responsibility for the death of the Lord's anointed. And lest anyone should think that David had a part in his death, the series of events here makes it clear that he does not. So David composes a song, and this is written in the book of Jashar. We see David's true despair at losing Saul, whom he revered as the chosen and blessed by God, as well as his friend Jonathan. And let's see, make sure, it's hard to see, sorry. In 1 Samuel, a couple verses that stick out to me and with which you'll probably be familiar is 25 through 26, especially poignant. How the mighty have fallen in battle. Jonathan lies slain on your heights. I grieve for you, Jonathan, my brother. You were very dear to me. Your love was more wonderful than that of women. It seems remarkable to our sensibilities that David so loved someone, not necessarily Jonathan, but Saul, who repeatedly tried to kill him, right? This kind of love seems to draw our minds inexorably to Matthew 5, verse 44, Jesus' words, to love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. Not like enemies that we have, like the woman who cuts in line at Starbucks ahead of us, but like true enemies who hate who we are, the very core of who we are. So chapter 2 then, after this lament and period of mourning, chapter 2 begins David's slow consolidation of authority, people and land, power, so forth. Over the course of the next few chapters, he's going to gradually unite the disparate Hebrew tribes. And of course, Saul had purview over all 12, but they've been fractured, and so eventually David is going to reunite them. He is first king over Judah and Benjamin, but then he brings the other 10 tribes under his rule as well eventually, and racks up victories against some of Israel's most notorious foes in the region. He is installed as king at the start of chapter 2 with his coronation that happens in the city of Hebron, where he's kind of set up. At that time, Abner, who is the commander of Saul's army, makes Ishbosheth. Ishbosheth? I've said it a million times, and now I'm tripping up. But one of Saul's surviving sons, the new king over the 10 tribes. So Saul's military commander installs a new king to rival David. There are skirmishes between these factions belonging to David, which is headed by Joab and Abner, that continue despite temporary truces. Joab eventually defects to join Judah, but he is killed by Joab. Ishbosheth is also killed, but by members of his own tribe, the Benjamites, who are in turn put to death by David. So lots of skirmishes, lots of battles, lots of death, lots of, trying to consolidate power. Chapter 5 brings us to, takes us about 7 years from the time that David had initially been crowned as king. And with Ishbosheth and Abner now gone, all 12 tribes come to Hebron to anoint David as king over a finally reunited Israel. So David takes this new mandate as an opportunity to conquer Jerusalem and rid it of its pagan occupants, the Jebusites. And David makes Israel's new capital city, and now he rebrands it as Zion. He not only makes it its new capital city, but he enlarges its borders, so he expands it. He wins decisive victories against the Philistines. And again, it's going to be a little hard to see. The gray is kind of we're talking about Jerusalem here specifically, but in terms of Israel's land, the gray is at the start of his reign, and the green is at the end of his reign. So just some context for how the victories he achieved in battle, the territory expansion, and so forth. So while ruling in Jerusalem, which we'll come back to, David has several children, including Solomon and Nathan. And unfortunately, he also takes this opportunity to add to his growing number of wives and concubines. So chapter 6 is primarily concerned with the Ark of the Covenant and its relocation to Jerusalem, as well as bringing the previously mobile tabernacle into the city. So during the Ark of the Covenant's heavily protected trip from Bela of Judah to Jerusalem, we have the well-known striking down of Uzzah when he reaches out his hand to keep the Ark of the Covenant from tipping over. I think Denny addressed that, someone addressed that years ago in terms of reconciling that with God's justice, benevolence, and so forth. We won't get into that now, but just as a reference point, because most of you will know that story. We also have the infamous schoolmarm scolding of Michal towards her husband David. David's crime, of course, was dancing joyously as the Ark of the Covenant entered Jerusalem. And David was intent on making the city not only the most important culturally and politically in Israel, but also, obviously, religiously. So chapter 7, that we'll look at a bit more and drill down into a bit, happens in this context of making Jerusalem the epicenter for everything that is happening in Israel. The ark is there. The tabernacle is there. It's the capital city and the seat of David's rule. It's the cultural, economic, and military fulcrum of the kingdom. At least that's what David's turning it into. And after finally establishing himself and his kingship in Jerusalem, David finds himself in a grand palace built by the finest cedars, from Lebanon, and but he looks at the comparatively Spartan state of the tabernacle compared to his own palace, and that tabernacle in which the ark resides, and reasons with his court prophet Nathan that maybe God's dwelling place isn't quite up to snuff. Maybe the tabernacle could stand to have an upgrade since he's already in this sweet new setup. Maybe the tabernacle can be as well. So as D.A. Carson points out, maybe David here too, maybe it's not all selfishness or guilt that's driving him to this conclusion. He might be thinking of Deuteronomy 12, 8 through 14, that foretells Israel's eventual conquering of the promised land and the peace and prosperity that would follow thereafter. In that passage, God seems to say that he would dwell and be worshipped in a more permanent structure, i.e. not the tabernacle, but something more like a temple, right? So it may have been that David was thinking of that. We don't know. But regardless, Nathan agrees with David's assessment. Yeah, we should build a new dwelling place for the ark. Israel should build a structure to supplant the mobile tabernacle with all of its decaying skins and linens and so forth. Of course, Nathan agrees to this without consulting God, even though he tells David, "Go do all that is in your heart, for the Lord is with you." Like, this seems like not a very good thing to tell somebody if you're a prophet, right? Like, yeah, you have God's imprimatur on that. Like, go and do it. But he hadn't consulted God, so in the words of Job Bluth, Nathan had made a huge mistake. The word of the Lord came to Nathan that very night and disabused him of him and David's plan. It is in this light that the promise of God comes to David in chapter 7 for an everlasting kingdom, a messianic dynasty, and true deliverance for Israel. Through Nathan, God makes the point to David that his instructions about the tabernacle haven't changed, right? Like, you don't need to do anything. We talked about this in the book of Exodus, right? Like, there's nothing new here. The laws governing the use, the construction, and so forth of the tabernacle, handed all the way down back in the Pentateuch, are still in effect and have not changed. Furthermore, God says, he does not need David to take the initiative and to come up with any ideas about how to assuage God. God will always be, and has always been, the one who takes the initiative with humans. We alluded to that a bit in the reading from Titus this morning, that we're not bringing anything, right? We're relying on God to do all the meaningful work, take all the initiative. In other words, when there's something important to be done, God will be the first mover, and he will be the instructor to his people about how to accomplish his purposes. God tells David, he more reminds him that he was the one that plucked David from the countryside outside of Bethlehem as a shepherd and made him great. David did not reach out to God and start that trajectory and extended blessing himself, right? In a blazing contrast to the deities of the surrounding pagan nations, the God of the Hebrews does not have any need, ontological or otherwise, for people, and he cannot and will not be manipulated by them. Again, this is a theme of pagan deities that, like, well, maybe you trick them into doing what you want, or maybe they're just glorified humans, right, with more power, right? But that is not the case for the God of the Hebrews. God's plans can't be thwarted, and he will let his people know precisely what's expected of them, not the other way around. But God really starts blowing David's mind when he says that not only will David not build him and the ark a new house, but that God will build a house for David. And this is kind of a pun on God's part. He does not mean a literal house, of course, but rather a dynasty of David's line that will, in God's words, extend forever. 1 Samuel 7:11 through 16, I didn't put the chapter there, unfortunately, says, "The Lord declares to you that the Lord himself will establish a house for you. When your days are over and you rest with your ancestors, I will raise up your offspring to succeed you, your own flesh and blood, and I will establish his kingdom. He is the one who will build a house for my name," not you, right? "And I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. I will be his father, and he will be my son. When he does wrong, I will punish him with a rod wielded by men, with floggings inflicted by human hands. But my love will never be taken away from him, as I took it away from Saul, whom I removed before you. Your house and your kingdom will endure forever before me. Your throne will be established forever." And the fact that billions of people over the course of the last 3,000 years have known the name and exploits of King David seems to indicate that God kept his promise, at least to the letter. God tells David that in the short term, David's son Solomon will be the one to build a permanent residence for God in the ark. Not David, Solomon will be. And we know how astonishing the first temple in Jerusalem was that Solomon built, right? Probably better than anything David had in mind at the time. But in the longer term, God says that he will establish the throne of David and Solomon's kingdom forever. And this would come as quite a surprise to David, since he had firsthand experience with the first king that Israel had, Saul, right? And he watched him and his only son get killed off together years prior. I mean, Saul's dynasty never even reached its second generation, but now God all of a sudden is promising David an everlasting kingdom and dynasty. So D.A. Carson points out, related to this promise of God, you can have an everlasting kingdom and kingship pretty much only two ways. Either you beget son after son after son after son after son ad infinitum for all of eternity, or you find a king who can live and reign forever. Not to spoil the ending here, but you can probably see where this is going. From the New Testament, the picture of Jesus that the author of Hebrews paints, as a prophet, priest, and king who operates and is qualified in chapter 7 on the basis of the power of an indestructible life. Luke 1:33 tells us of Jesus that he will rule over the house of Jacob forever, and of his kingdom there will be no end. Revelation 11:15 says, the kingdom of the world has become the kingdom of our Lord and his Christ, and he shall reign forever and ever. From the Old Testament, Isaiah 9:6 through 7, a set of verses with which we're all very familiar and recite often around this time of year, or coming up to this time of year. For to us a child is born, to us a son is given, and the government will be on his shoulders, and he will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. Of the greatness of his government and peace there will be no end. He will reign on David's throne and over his kingdom, establishing and upholding it with justice and righteousness from that time on and forever. The zeal of the Lord Almighty will accomplish this. And Daniel 4:3, his kingdom is an everlasting kingdom, and his dominion endures from generation to generation. Micah 4:7, the Lord will reign over them in Mount Zion from this time forth and forevermore. This promise of God in chapter 7 of 2 Samuel to establish a kingdom that starts with David and lasts into eternity astounds David. He spends the rest of the chapter actually much longer than God's deliverance of the promise to David. David then just goes on this astonished soliloquy, oh my gosh, I can't believe this happened. You're so great. How could this be? Which is a wholly appropriate response. It just goes on and on and on and on and on. So he spends the rest of the chapter praising God in wonder and thankfulness for what he has heard. The words of Nathan that started with a rebuke for David's hubris have now revealed a plan and provision that David can't even really believe. Though perhaps God couldn't have put the pieces though perhaps David could not have put the pieces together at that moment, this decree of God was just another intricate piece of the Lord's redemptive plan for his people. It started with a promise to Abraham all the way back in Genesis in the Ur of the Chaldees to make Abraham's descendants more numerous than the stars in the sky. It flowed through the patriarchs, the enslavement in Egypt, the sojourn in the wilderness, the taking of the promised land, all the way through the judges and now kings of the Hebrews. It would subsequently move through Solomon, the increasingly fractious kingdom, the prophets, up to beyond the judgment, exile, and the return to the promised land, the rebuilding of the temple, and the 400 years of silence that followed. But then, just as it seemed that God had forgotten in this 400 years of silence in the intertestamental period, that he had forgotten his people and that perhaps his promise was broken of kingly succession and an eternal kingdom, the words of Matthew in his Gospel's genealogy ring out in verse 1, the very start of the New Testament. This is the genealogy of Jesus, the son of David, the son of Abraham. God had obviously not forgotten his promise from 1,000 years prior. And it should be noted that one of Jesus' favorite topics, of course, to discuss in the gospel is the kingdom of God. That can trace its origins in part all the way back to this promise of the Davidic dynasty that started with the same oath. The kingdom of David will be forever, and from it will come the Messiah, the one who will uphold it and establish it forever. So that was chapter 7 and a little excursus. Let's go back to keep going with chapter 8. Chapter 8 sees more military dominance against the Philistines. Remember, David at this point is expanding his reach. If we go back just a couple slides, he's building his territory, expanding Israel as a united nation. David's armies also have success against the Moabites, Edomites, and others. Chapter 9 chronicles David's discovery that a grandson of Saul, that's Jonathan's son, Mephibosheth, is still alive. He didn't know. He didn't know if there were any descendants of Saul that were still around. David summons Mephibosheth, and showers him with gifts, affirmation, servants, and he gives him an appointment in the royal palace. He's happy to see him. So chapter 10 then records an odd episode of David. He sends ambassadors to the Ammonites because the Ammonites' king, whose name is Hanun, has lost his father. And David, thinking fondly on Hanun, or on his father, sends ambassadors to offer their condolences. But Hanun and the Ammonites think that these ambassadors are spies, and so they do some weird stuff to them and humiliate them publicly. They shave their beards, they strip off some of their clothes in public. It's really weird. So net result of that is David sends his army against the Ammonites. They try and recruit a bunch of mercenaries to fight, and the Israelites and David achieve victory over them. So chapters 11 and 12 see David finish the job against the Ammonites by taking over all their cities. But these two chapters are better known for kind of, if you had to pick out a, pardon the word, but a seminal part of David's life, this chapter 11 and 12 would be kind of where your mind would go, because this is obviously his indiscretion with, this chronicles his indiscretion with Bathsheba and the fallout from that. It also serves as the high point in the arc, those arcs that we looked at earlier, high point in the arc of blessing, transitioning to judgment and demise. And you know the story, but a quick summary. David commits adultery with Bathsheba, gets Bathsheba's husband Uriah killed to cover it up. He's confronted and rebuked by Nathan, the prophet. He repents and ultimately loses his son that was born from his union with Bathsheba. David marries Bathsheba, and she gives birth to another child, Solomon. So chapters 13 and 14 show the continued effects of David's sin and gradual diminishing, and also the sins of his children. David's son Amnon rapes his half-sister Tamar, and Tamar's brother and David's son Absalom avenges her and eventually kills Amnon. Absalom flees Jerusalem and hides out for a time, but he's persuaded to come back and reconcile with David in Jerusalem. So at this time, in chapters 15 and 16, Absalom gains favor with Israel over time and eventually rebels against David. Then David himself, Absalom was the one that had fled, and gone into the wilderness years before, but now David flees. But he takes a bunch of his men with him. During his time in exile, David sends a friend of his, Hushai, to go back to Jerusalem and infiltrate Absalom's newly minted court, sabotaging Absalom by giving him bad advice. This is like Cosmo Kramer removing desiccant packets to make clothes noticeably musty years later. This is a really long game, long-term plan from David. He's like, you just go back to Jerusalem, you befriend Absalom, hang out in his court of advisors for a while, and then when the time is right, give him some bad advice. And so, but that works somehow. But before that works, Absalom pulls this disgusting stunt where he pitches a tent on top of the royal palace, brings all of David's concubines up there, and sleeps with them in a public manner to humiliate David. And again, David's not there at the time. Hushai eventually gives Absalom bad advice. Of course, that works out, that Hushai acts upon. David's plan pays off. Absalom pursues a fleeing David, both men with their attendant armies, and they finally fight, and David warns his men. He says, do not, especially as Absalom and his retreating forces are fleeing, he tells his men, do not harm Absalom. But Absalom becomes ensnared and can't run anymore, and is killed by David's men in direct, with disobeying what David had told them. So just as David mourned over the loss of Saul, Jonathan, and his child with Bathsheba, so now he mourns over Absalom in chapters 19 and 20. Nevertheless, after this period of mourning, he returns to Jerusalem to assume the throne again under the protection of the tribe of Judah. Various military accomplishments happen in chapter 20, though David is now considerably diminished and broken. So the last 3 chapters of the book, as we look to wrap up, there we go, are a little odd in that they kind of look, it's not exactly in chronological order like most of the rest of the book was. These final verses and stories form a sort of chiasmus to conclude the account of David and to serve to tie the whole book, 1st and 2nd Samuel, together. So the bookends here are the story of Saul's failure to honor his treaty with the Gibeonites in chapter 21, and then David, this is a strange way for our modern sensibilities to end the book in chapter 24, but David takes a census that God is displeased with in chapter 24 and is judged for it. In both cases, the 2 kings, Saul and David, thus far in Israel's history, demonstrate their moral failings and disqualifying characteristics as monarchs. Many thousands die as a result of Saul and David's iniquity. So in chapter 21, actually David inquires with God about why there's famine in the land. There's been famine in Israel for several years at that point, and he is told by God that it's because Saul attacked the Gibeonites despite the treaty that they had years prior. The Gibeonites then, David goes to him and is like, how can we make this right? The Gibeonites demand that several of Saul's descendants be put to death and executed to satisfy their wrath. David agrees, but he excludes Jonathan's son, Saul's grandson, Mephibosheth, that we talked about earlier. And as punishment for David, so if we now go to chapter 24, David's failure regarding the census, David elects to have, basically, he takes a census, God is displeased with it. God says you can choose basically 3 punishments. You can have a military defeat, you can have a famine, which he's already had, or you can have a plague come upon Israel, and David chooses the plague. So lots of people die. So moral failings of the monarchs on the outside here. Once we get inside, the next pair of stories are concerning David's victories against the Philistines, but victories in which he was dependent on the help of others, like totally dependent on the help of others. Just as his exploits started as a shepherd boy, slaying the Philistine Goliath with the miraculous aid of God, so too David is totally reliant upon his mighty men, David's mighty men, in battle. That's what these 2 stories illustrate. As he is in a weak and broken state, he needs all their assistance. David's mighty men do what he could not do for himself. And finally, we come to the center of this, which is the focal point, which is designed to draw our attention there, which are kind of out of place for the book of 2 Samuel, but these poems that David writes in chapters 22 and 23, they kind of take us back to Hannah's song at the start or near the start of 1 Samuel. These poems that David writes are all about thanksgiving to God and praise for the Lord's provision for David and for Israel in general. He is profoundly grateful to God despite all that has happened over the second half of over the last, many chapters of the book, all of the terrible things that have befallen him and have befallen the nation. But he's thankful to God for God's protection, power, deliverance, sustaining presence, divine justice even when it's been directed at him and Israel. As David looks back over his life, he sees the hand of God in upholding him against his enemies, despite his own wickedness. And this is fitting for a couple of reasons. First, it fits the structure in which it's presented. The outer stories show the moral failings of Saul and David. The inner stories show David's dependence upon others. And the poems in the center show David's ultimate need and gratitude for God. Also, these poems, as I mentioned before, remind us of the first few verses of 1 Samuel 2, which is Hannah's song to God that John talked about. Both Hannah's and David's poems and the stories that surround them look forward to the promised Messianic King in the age to come. Both bookends remind the reader and the listener at the time of God's ability to accomplish his plans despite human sin and frailty. And both accounts accentuate humanity's unfailing need for the love and rescue and preservation by the God of the universe. Unless the reader is tempted to dwell on the increasingly chaotic mess that was the end of Eli's life and Samuel's life and David's life and leadership, David and Hannah's prayers and songs to the Lord help to properly frame all that's happened in these 55 chapters of 1st and 2nd Samuel. God will accomplish his purposes through sinful people. He is faithful, eager to bless, and he is true. And though the period that follows with Solomon's kingship and the separation of the kingdoms after that and the eventual exile is a dark period, a truly dark period in the history of God's people, he remains loyal to them and will continue his promises just as he does for us today. At this time, if the musicians could come up, I think we have a song to close the service.